The night was quiet, the kind of stillness that makes you think everything is fine in the world. But that peace was about to be shattered, not by a person, but by an unlikely hero, one with 4 paws, a wagging tail, and an instinctive drive to protect. This wasn't just any dog, and this wasn't just another robbery. What happened that night would change the lives of everyone involved, proving that heroism can come in all shapes and sizes. Imagine this, it's just after dark, the lights are dimming at a local convenience store, and the storekeeper is wrapping up his day. He doesn't know it yet, but he's about to face the most terrifying moment of his life. Outside, a man in a hood watches the store through the window, his hands twitching with impatience. He steps closer, checking for any signs of movement. The door creaks open, and with it, the start of a crime that could have ended badly. But then something extraordinary happens. In the back, a dog is resting. He's not just any dog, he's a trained service dog, the companion of a local police officer who had brought him to work earlier that day. His name is Max, a German shepherd with sharp instincts and an unbreakable bond with his handler. Max had been napping, unaware of what was about to unfold. But as soon as he hears the faintest noise, footsteps, a door opening, he lifts his head. His ears twitch, his body goes still. Something is wrong. Max has faced many challenges before. From tracking criminals to comforting victims, he's always been more than just a pet. But this moment, this robbery, was unlike anything he had experienced. The intruder steps inside, his eyes scanning for cash, for valuables. He's focused, unaware of the quiet presence that is slowly closing in on him. Max, without hesitation, springs into action. He rushes forward with a speed and precision that only a trained dog could possess, his bark echoing through the store. The thief is caught off guard. His eyes widen as the massive dog charges toward him, teeth bared in a warning that could not be ignored. The scene escalates in an instant. One moment, the thief is sneaking toward the register, and the next, he's in a struggle with Max, who is determined to protect his territory. Panic sets in. The man tries to push Max away, but it's clear he's no match for the dog's strength and training. For a moment, the thief hesitates, unsure of what to do next. But Max isn't backing down. He lunges, blocking the man's path, forcing him to stumble. The storekeeper, now wide-eyed and frozen in fear, watches in shock as the dog takes control of the situation. The robbery has been stopped, at least for the moment. But what will happen next? What happens next in this incredible tale is more than just a quick win for Max. This is where the story really begins to unfold. The thief isn't just going to give up that easily. And Max, despite his bravery, is in a position that will test every ounce of his training. The tension rises as the storekeeper calls for help, but the only question on everyone's mind is whether the situation will de-escalate without further violence, or if it will spiral into something far worse. With the thief cornered, Max stands watch, alert, ready for whatever comes next. His loyalty to his handler, his courage in the face of danger, and his unwavering desire to protect are about to be put to the ultimate test. The stakes are higher than ever as the story unfolds. This is no longer just a robbery gone wrong, it's the beginning of an unbelievable journey that no one could have predicted. But just when it seems like the situation might resolve, a surprise twist takes things in a direction no one expected. Stay with us as we dive deeper into this unbelievable act of heroism and uncover what happens next in the most unexpected way. This is the story of how one dog, against all odds, stopped a robbery and proved that sometimes, the greatest heroes come from the most unexpected places. Max's ears twitched, his stance still firm as he kept his eyes locked on the intruder. The man had backed up a few paces, uncertain now, eyes flicking nervously toward the door. His hand hovered near his waistband, where he no doubt had a weapon, but Max was quicker. The dog wasn't just relying on brute force, his instincts, honed over countless hours of training, were guiding him through the situation with precision. Every movement the thief made, Max mirrored it, anticipating the next step before it even happened. The thief's breath quickened, his fingers tapping anxiously against the side of his body. The storekeeper, still frozen in place behind the counter, had his hands clutched to the edge of the countertop, trying to keep his composure while panic crept into his mind. He hadn't ever imagined a dog would be the one to stand between him and a criminal. Most people, including himself, had assumed that a robbery would be something handled by the police, not some random dog in a store. But Max wasn't just a dog. Max was a force, a creature of training and instinct, dedicated to protecting those in need. For a brief moment, time seemed to slow. The storekeeper could hear the soft panting of Max, feel the tension in the air as the man in front of him hesitated, weighing his options. He had come here for one reason, to get the cash. But Max, the German shepherd, was not going to let him get any closer. The dog was in his way, his growl low but fierce, a constant reminder of the force standing between him and his goal. The thief shifted, clearly uncertain now about what his next move should be. It had only been a matter of seconds since Max had launched into action, but it felt like an eternity. What could have been a violent and dangerous moment, one that could have ended with the storekeeper injured or worse, was now a standstill. Max wasn't letting the thief get away, but neither was he pushing for an all-out confrontation. He was waiting, watching, ready to act if necessary, but hoping for a peaceful resolution. In that brief pause, the thief glanced at the door again, a desperate hope flashing in his eyes. But Max saw it. He saw the shift in the man's gaze, the subtle, barely perceptible motion as his fingers curled tighter around the gun tucked into his waistband. The danger was far from over. Max's muscles tensed, his hackles rising, and his posture shifted. He was ready. If the man made a move toward the weapon, Max would act, and he wouldn't hesitate. The storekeeper, his heart racing, took a few slow, cautious steps toward the back of the counter. He could barely breathe, the weight of the situation pressing on him like a heavy blanket. He thought about calling the police, but the fear of making a wrong move held him back. What if he triggered the thief to act out of panic? What if he made the situation worse? And then there was Max, standing guard, the one thing between him and whatever else was coming. He glanced at the dog and saw the determination in its eyes, the kind of focus that only comes from years of training, from being a partner to the very people who risk their lives every day. It wasn't long before the thief spoke, his voice shaking with frustration. "Just move. I'm not gonna hurt you." His words were half-hearted, his bravado cracking under the pressure of being watched by the dog. But there was a crack in his voice, and the storekeeper could see the uncertainty in his eyes. This wasn't a hardened criminal, it was someone desperate, someone who had chosen the wrong place and the wrong time to commit his crime. Max, still poised in the middle of the store, didn't move. His gaze didn't waver. He was watching every movement, every twitch in the thief's body language. He was waiting for the signal to act. His handler, Officer Ryan, had always told him that the most important part of his job wasn't the physical confrontation, it was reading the situation, knowing when to act, and when to let things play out. Max trusted that training, but he also trusted his instincts. And right now, those instincts were screaming at him that something wasn't right. Suddenly, there was a loud sound, a car horn blaring from outside, followed by the screech of tires. The thief's head snapped toward the window. It was the kind of distraction that someone like Max couldn't afford, but it seemed to work. The thief, flustered by the noise and desperate to escape, took a step back toward the door. It was a chance, a moment of weakness, and Max lunged forward without hesitation. The thief screamed, not from pain but from the shock of being knocked off balance by the powerful dog. Max's teeth didn't touch him, but they were close enough to remind him that he had made a mistake. The storekeeper, still in shock, barely processed what happened next. The thief, now stumbling, reached for his gun. It was the only move left to him. He needed to defend himself, but in doing so, he was about to escalate the situation even further. Max wasn't giving him a chance. Before the man could even pull the weapon from his waistband, the dog was there, knocking his arm aside with a swift and practiced motion. The thief staggered, his gun dropping to the floor with a loud clink. The storekeeper's heart was in his throat. It wasn't over, not yet. The man was angry, his face twisted in frustration and fear, but Max had disarmed him, had given them both a moment to breathe. And that's when the unexpected happened. The storekeeper, finally gathering his wits, rushed to the phone in the back. He wasn't going to wait any longer. He dialed 911, his hands trembling as he gave the dispatcher the details. But just as he hung up the phone, a strange feeling settled in the pit of his stomach. The man wasn't backing down. He was still desperate. And in that moment, the storekeeper realized something chilling. There was something deeper, something more complicated behind this robbery than he had first assumed. The man's eyes weren't just filled with fear, they were filled with something else, something that was more dangerous than desperation. Max stood his ground, his eyes never leaving the thief. The dog had done his job. He had stopped the man from escaping and, in the process, had forced him to drop the weapon. But the tension in the room was still palpable. The robber, now cornered, had nowhere to go. The door behind him was shut tight, the way out blocked by a large, barking German shepherd. And yet, the man didn't look ready to give up. Something was off. The storekeeper watched, unable to shake the feeling that this was more than just a robbery gone wrong. Max's growls grew louder, the hairs on his back standing on end as if sensing the same thing. But before anything else could happen, the sound of sirens filled the air, growing louder by the second. Relief flooded the storekeeper's body, but that feeling was short-lived. The thief didn't look scared at the sound of the approaching police. It was as if he was preparing for something else, something that could change everything. The sirens grew closer, but so did the mystery. Why wasn't the thief scared? What was he really after? And why, despite all the signs, was he still standing firm, unwilling to run or surrender? The answer to those questions was still coming. But as the storekeeper and Max braced themselves for the arrival of the police, they had no idea what was waiting just around the corner. The sirens grew louder, but they weren't the comforting sound the storekeeper had hoped for. As they wailed in the distance, something else, something much more sinister, began to creep into the air. The thief wasn't backing down. In fact, he seemed almost prepared. The storekeeper's hands shook as he kept his eyes on the man, his body tense, his mind racing with questions. Why wasn't the man trying to flee? What was he waiting for? Max, sensing the unease, lowered his body closer to the ground, his growls deepening, more ferocious than before. The dog's eyes never left the thief, who stood frozen near the door, his chest rising and falling with each shallow breath. It was clear he wasn't just trying to escape. He was waiting for something, or rather, someone. But who? And then, a new noise. A low click. The unmistakable sound of a door being unlocked. The storekeeper's heart stopped. His gaze flicked to the back of the store, where a second door led into a small storage room. That door should have been locked. No one was supposed to have access to it, certainly not the thief. But there it was, wide open now, and standing in the doorway was a figure, one who looked all too familiar. It was Officer Ryan. But this wasn't the officer the storekeeper knew. His face, usually calm and composed, was now strained, his eyes flickering with an anxiety the storekeeper had never seen before. He was holding a gun. It wasn't pointed at the thief, but it was in his hand, ready. His uniform was disheveled, his movements erratic. Ryan? The storekeeper's voice trembled, unsure if he was seeing things correctly. He had never seen Officer Ryan act this way, never seen him look anything other than calm and collected. Yet now, here he was, standing in the doorway with the same gun that had just been dropped by the thief. "Stay back," Officer Ryan's voice was harsh, his tone carrying a weight the storekeeper couldn't quite place. His eyes flicked toward Max, who stood still, watching the officer closely, but didn't bark or charge. Max was tense, alert to something the storekeeper couldn't quite understand. The thief, for the first time, smiled. A twisted, knowing grin spread across his face, as though everything had fallen into place. "I knew you'd be here sooner or later," he said, his voice suddenly calm, almost casual. Ryan didn't respond, but the tension in the room was thick enough to cut with a knife. The storekeeper looked back and forth between the two men. Something was terribly wrong. Officer Ryan wasn't here to arrest the thief. He wasn't here to help them. He was here for something else. The entire situation felt like a setup, and the pieces were slowly but unmistakably falling into place. "I don't understand," the storekeeper finally managed to say, his voice trembling with confusion. "Ryan, what's going on? You're with him?" Ryan's eyes flicked to the storekeeper, but he didn't answer immediately. He just stood there, his grip tightening on the gun. It wasn't aimed at anyone yet, but the unease in the room grew with each passing second. Max growled softly, sensing the growing tension, but didn't move. The dog had always trusted Ryan, had followed his commands without question. But now, there was doubt in the air. Max, too, could sense that something was wrong. His loyalty to Ryan was beginning to falter. "I didn't want it to go like this," Ryan muttered, his voice strained, as though he were speaking more to himself than to anyone else. "But it's too late. You don't understand, none of you do." "What are you talking about?" the storekeeper asked, his voice rising in disbelief. "You're a cop. You're supposed to stop this." The thief's grin widened, and he took a slow step forward, his hands raised in mock surrender. "Oh, but he's not the only one in on it, is he?" The words hung in the air, each one slicing through the tension like a sharp knife. "Tell him, Ryan. Tell him why you're really here." Ryan's jaw clenched, and for the briefest moment, he seemed to hesitate. But the hesitation was enough to confirm the storekeeper's worst fears. It wasn't just the thief that had something to hide. Officer Ryan was part of it too. For a moment, the room seemed to collapse under the weight of the revelation. The sirens continued to scream in the distance, but they seemed farther away now, irrelevant. The danger was already here, in the room with them, and it was far more complicated than anyone had imagined. Max, sensing his handler's distress, slowly began to inch closer to him, as though trying to offer some comfort. But the situation was spiraling out of control. The storekeeper didn't know who to trust anymore. He had thought he could count on Officer Ryan, the one man who had always seemed reliable, steady, and trustworthy. But now, the man was standing there with a gun in his hand, his expression cold, and a grim determination in his eyes. "You don't understand, do you?" Ryan said finally, his voice lower now, almost apologetic. "You never will. I didn't want this to happen, but there's no other way. The money, it's not just about the robbery. It's about everything. It's about survival." The storekeeper stared at Ryan, his mind racing to put the pieces together. He glanced at the thief, who was watching this exchange with an almost satisfied look on his face. This was no ordinary robbery. This was something deeper, something tied to Ryan, something the storekeeper hadn't been prepared for. "What do you mean, survival?" the storekeeper asked, his voice trembling with both fear and disbelief. Ryan swallowed hard, and for the first time, his eyes seemed to soften, just a little. "There's a lot you don't know. I'm in too deep. There are things happening in this town, things that you wouldn't believe if I told you. And I didn't have a choice. Neither of us did." The storekeeper took a step back, his eyes wide with realization. It was becoming clear now that Ryan wasn't just working with the thief. He was working for something or someone else entirely. He was a pawn in a much larger game, one with stakes the storekeeper couldn't even begin to understand. Max's growls intensified as he sensed the growing tension. The dog had been with Ryan long enough to know when things weren't right. He barked, louder this time, but Ryan didn't react. It was as if Max was a mere bystander in a conflict that was far beyond his control. And just then, the storekeeper's phone rang. He nearly jumped, startled by the sudden intrusion. He glanced at the caller ID, and his heart skipped a beat. It was the police. The real police. But what did that mean? Why had they called him now, when the entire situation was falling apart? The storekeeper answered the phone shakily, his mind spinning as he tried to make sense of everything that was happening. But the voice on the other end didn't bring the relief he expected. Instead, it sent a chill down his spine. "We know what's happening," the voice said, sounding urgent. "Get out of there. Now. It's a setup. Ryan's been compromised. We need you to get away." The words hit the storekeeper like a ton of bricks. Ryan had been compromised? The officer, who had seemed like their protector, had been part of this all along. There was no way out now, not unless he acted quickly. He hung up the phone, his hands shaking. "Ryan," he said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper, "what's really going on?" Ryan didn't respond. Instead, he turned slowly, and for the first time, he raised the gun. But this time, it wasn't aimed at the thief. It was aimed directly at the storekeeper. The weight of Ryan's gun in the air was unmistakable. The cold barrel gleamed under the flickering fluorescent lights of the store, a silent, threatening reminder of how deep the trap had been set. The storekeeper's heart pounded in his chest, his mind racing to process everything he had just learned. Ryan, the officer who had always seemed like a steady hand, was now holding a gun on him. Not in defense of the law, not for justice, but as part of some twisted scheme that the storekeeper couldn't even begin to understand. Max, the ever-loyal German shepherd, sensed the shift instantly. The tension in the air had become suffocating, and the dog's low growl reverberated through the room. He had been trained to protect, to serve alongside his handler. But right now, he was caught in a situation that was beyond even his training. Max's eyes darted from Ryan to the thief and back again, his body stiff and alert, but he didn't move. He knew better than to charge into a confrontation without understanding what was truly at stake. The storekeeper took a step back, his breath shallow, his mind spiraling into confusion. "Ryan, why? Why would you do this? You're supposed to protect us. You're a cop." His voice cracked with disbelief, his world crumbling in front of him. Ryan's jaw tightened, and he exhaled slowly, his gaze never leaving the storekeeper. "I didn't want this to happen. I didn't have a choice." His voice was flat, emotionless, as if this was the inevitable end of a long, twisted road. "You don't know what they're capable of, what they've been forcing me to do. If I don't play along, I'm as good as dead. You'd be dead too." The words hit the storekeeper like a punch in the gut. He had seen Ryan at his best, the officer who had always seemed so reliable, so trustworthy. Now, that man was a ghost, a shadow of the person he once was. And all for what? A robbery? Or was this something much worse? "I don't know what you're involved in, but you're wrong if you think I'm just going to stand here and let this happen." The storekeeper's voice had a newfound edge to it. The weight of the gun was undeniable, but he wasn't going to let fear paralyze him, not again. Ryan's eyes flickered, the briefest moment of hesitation passing over his face before he spoke again. "It's not that simple. There are bigger things going on here, things that you can't even begin to understand. They've got too much power. And he broke off, shaking his head. "I didn't want to drag you into this. But now you're here, and it's too late. You've seen too much. The thief, still standing near the door, let out a low chuckle, the sound grating against the growing tension. You really think you're going to get away from this, Ryan? The moment you let him live, everything's over. You know that, right? His voice dripped with a smug certainty that made the storekeeper's skin crawl. Ryan didn't respond. He just kept his gun trained on the storekeeper, his hand shaking slightly. The storekeeper's mind spun, his thoughts racing. If he was going to get out of this, if he was going to stop Ryan and the thief, he needed to act fast. In a split second, the storekeeper made his move. He darted to the side, using the counter as cover, hoping to buy himself some time. Max's instinct kicked in immediately. The dog leaped forward, his powerful legs propelling him toward the thief with a force that made the man stumble back in shock. Max's teeth flashed as he clamped down on the thief's arm, pulling him off balance. The thief screamed in pain, the gun he had been clutching dropping to the floor with a loud clatter. In that instant, everything changed. The storekeeper, breathing heavily, moved quickly to grab the gun, but Ryan was faster. With a swift motion, Ryan swung the weapon toward him, but Max, sensing the danger, lunged between them, his powerful body acting as a shield. "No!" Ryan shouted, his voice cracking as he tried to push Max out of the way. But Max wasn't moving. The dog stood firm, growling as he kept himself planted between his handler and the thief. It was clear now Max wasn't just defending the storekeeper. He was defending the people he loved, the people he trusted. For a moment, there was nothing but chaos. Max barking, the thief struggling, the storekeeper trying to control his fear while he scrambled to think of a way out. But amid the noise and confusion, something else was happening. Ryan's grip on the gun was slipping. He was starting to panic, his eyes darting between the thief and the storekeeper. "You've gone too far, Ryan," the storekeeper said, his voice trembling but determined. "This isn't you. You're not this person. You have a choice. You can still make it right." Ryan's eyes flickered, and for the first time, there was a crack in the cold mask he had been wearing. He lowered the gun slightly, his gaze shifting to Max, to the storekeeper, and then back to the thief. The man on the floor was still struggling to get free, but the moment of hesitation was all the storekeeper needed. He lunged forward, grabbing the gun before Ryan could react. In one swift motion, he disarmed the officer, holding the gun tightly in his hands. The entire room seemed to freeze, the balance of power shifting in an instant. Ryan didn't move, his face pale with shock as he stared at the storekeeper, his eyes wide with disbelief. "What are you going to do now?" Ryan's voice was small, the fight leaving him. It was clear now he was no longer in control. The weight of his own actions had caught up with him. The storekeeper held the gun steady, but he didn't point it at Ryan. Instead, he kept his focus on the thief, whose struggles were becoming more desperate with every passing second. "I'm not a cop. I'm just a man trying to survive," the storekeeper said, his voice calm but firm. "But I won't let you hurt anyone else." The thief's eyes narrowed as he assessed the situation, his grin slowly fading as he realized the tables had turned. He wasn't getting out of this. Not without consequences. It was in that moment that everything seemed to collapse in on itself. The door at the back of the store, the one that had been unlocked earlier, creaked open. A shadowy figure stepped through, silhouetted against the dim light from the street. The storekeeper's heart skipped a beat. It wasn't another officer, it was something far worse. A man in a black suit, his face obscured by a dark hat, stepped into the room with an air of authority that made the air feel colder. The thief's eyes went wide with panic. "No, not you. Not now." The man in the suit raised a hand, silencing him instantly. "You've made a mess of things," he said, his voice calm but cold. "But we're here to clean it up." The storekeeper's blood ran cold. Who was this man? What did he mean by cleaning it up? Had this all been part of a larger plan from the beginning? Before anyone could react, the man in the suit turned his gaze toward Ryan. "You've failed, officer," he said, his tone almost sympathetic. "But don't worry. We'll take care of it." Ryan's face twisted in fear, but he didn't have time to say another word. The man in the suit pulled out a device from his pocket, pressing a button that sent a sharp, high-pitched sound through the room. It was a signal that the situation was about to escalate beyond anyone's control. And that's when the world seemed to shift again. A sudden explosion of light filled the room, blinding everyone for a split second. The storekeeper and Max shielded their eyes, and when the light faded, everything had changed once again. The thief was gone. Ryan was on the floor, unconscious. The man in the suit was nowhere to be found. The only thing left was the lingering sound of the sirens, now so close it felt like they were right outside the door. But what had just happened? Who was behind all of this? The storekeeper stood in the wreckage, his breath coming in ragged gasps, his hands still clutching the gun. Max, ever loyal, stood beside him, his gaze scanning the room. The tension was still thick in the air, and for the first time, the storekeeper understood that he had just stumbled into a much larger conspiracy, a conspiracy that was far from over. The story wasn't finished. It was just beginning. And the answers, if they even existed, were still far beyond his reach. The storekeeper's mind raced as he surveyed the wreckage of the scene, his breath shallow and uneven. Max stood by his side, every muscle in the dog's body tense, alert, but without the usual confidence. It wasn't over. Not yet. The man in the suit, the figure who had appeared so suddenly, had vanished just as quickly. No one had seen him leave, but the effect of his presence lingered in the air like a heavy fog. The sirens wailed in the distance, growing closer by the second. The tension in the store was palpable, everything still felt on edge, as if danger was just waiting to strike again. The storekeeper crouched down to check on Ryan, who lay on the floor, his face pale and still. The officer was breathing, but unconscious. The gun had fallen from his hand, and his body lay awkwardly against the floor, his uniform crumpled. The storekeeper didn't know what to feel: anger, betrayal, confusion, fear. It was all mixed together. He had trusted Ryan. He had never once doubted the officer's loyalty or intentions. But now, in the cold aftermath, he realized that trust had been shattered. Ryan wasn't just part of this mess. He was the mess. Max nudged the storekeeper's arm gently, as if trying to reassure him, though the dog was just as unsettled. The storekeeper patted Max's head, a small comfort in the midst of chaos. But they both knew that this was only the beginning of something bigger. The man in the suit was still out there, and the questions were piling up. Who was he? What did he want with Ryan? And more importantly, why had the entire situation unfolded the way it had? The sirens were now practically deafening, their wail filling the room, signaling that the authorities were close. But the storekeeper didn't feel relief. If anything, he felt a knot tightening in his stomach. What had just happened here wasn't something that could be easily explained. The police would have questions, hard questions. And they would want answers. They wouldn't just let this slide. Ryan, the officer who had been compromised, wouldn't be able to protect the storekeeper now. The storekeeper was alone in this, forced to deal with the fallout of an entire operation he didn't even know existed. Before he could think much more about it, the door to the store burst open. Two uniformed officers rushed in, followed closely by a medic. The officer leading the charge was someone the storekeeper recognized, a senior officer from the precinct who had often worked with Ryan. "Is everyone all right?" The officer called out, looking around the room, taking in the scene. His gaze settled on Ryan first, then flicked to the storekeeper, then to Max, who was still standing at attention. The storekeeper swallowed hard, the weight of the situation pressing down on him. "Ryan. He's out cold," he said, nodding toward the officer's prone body. He was part of this. I don't know how much of it, but... His voice trailed off as the reality of it sank in. The officer hadn't just been a witness to this. He'd been involved. The senior officer, his expression darkening, kneeled beside Ryan, checking his pulse. After a moment, he stood up and turned to the storekeeper. "You're right. Ryan's been compromised," he said quietly. "We've been watching him for weeks. It looks like he was under their control." The storekeeper's eyes widened, his confusion deepening. "Under whose control? Who are they?" The officer looked at him with a mix of concern and frustration. "We don't have all the details yet, but it's a crime syndicate and organization with connections all over the city. We were already investigating Ryan for suspicious behavior. He's been working as a mole for them, feeding them intel, helping them coordinate heists like this one." The storekeeper shook his head in disbelief. "But I trusted him." "He's the one who..." He stopped himself, realizing the implications of what he was about to say. Ryan had been the one to reassure him, the one who had seemed like the only person he could count on. He'd been the one to handle the situation with the thief. He'd seemed like their savior, but it had all been a lie. "We're going to get to the bottom of this," the senior officer said, his tone firm. "But for now, you need to know that we're taking Ryan into custody. This is bigger than any of us realized. We'll be investigating everything from top to bottom, and you'll be asked to testify." The storekeeper nodded, though 1,000 questions still lingered in his mind. The world he had known had completely shifted in the span of a few hours. His life, his trust in people, had all been turned upside down. And yet, as he stood there, looking at Ryan's unconscious form, something inside him told him that the worst wasn't over. No, this was just the beginning. As the officers began to secure the scene and load Ryan into the back of an ambulance, the storekeeper and Max stayed behind, watching in silence. The chaos had quieted, but there was a quiet unease that clung to the air. Max, ever loyal, stood close to the storekeeper, sensing the tension. A few minutes later, one of the officers approached the storekeeper again, a serious expression on his face. "We've got something else," he said, handing over a small, black device. "This was found on Ryan's person. We've been analyzing it. It's some sort of tracking device. We don't know who put it there, but it's clear that Ryan wasn't working alone." The storekeeper took the device from the officer's hand, examining it closely. It looked like nothing more than a small, nondescript piece of tech. But the implications were enormous. Whoever had placed this on Ryan had been watching him. They had been monitoring every move, every step. "What does this mean?" the storekeeper asked, his voice low. "It means that Ryan's not the only one involved," the officer replied. "This goes deeper than we thought. Someone is pulling the strings, and they're not done yet. If Ryan was compromised, then we've got to find out who's been orchestrating all of this." A cold shiver ran down the storekeeper's spine. He realized that no matter what he had thought about Ryan or the thief, there were far more dangerous players involved. This wasn't just about a robbery or a corrupt officer. This was about an underground network that had been operating in the shadows for far longer than anyone could have imagined. As the officers continued their investigation, the storekeeper was left standing in the middle of the store, his mind still reeling from the revelations. He had learned a lot in a short amount of time, but the questions were piling up faster than he could process them. Who were these people? How deep did this go? And most pressing of all, why had the man in the suit intervened at the last moment? Max, sensing the storekeeper's unease, nudged his side once more, offering silent comfort. The dog's loyalty was unwavering, even in the face of uncertainty. For a moment, the storekeeper allowed himself to breathe. He wasn't alone. He still had Max. And together, they would face whatever came next.